Hi everyone, Wayne Unger here. Usually I record my videos on Instagram TV, except now I'm going to post this particular video on YouTube so that it can be shared. So it can be shared widely and broadly to your friends, your family, and your colleagues. And maybe we'll get the message out. But I feel compelled to speak of yesterday's events. On January 6, 2021, the insurrection against the United States of America and the siege upon the United States Capitol building in Washington, D.C. There's a lot of talk, and so I feel like maybe we should clarify what exactly happened and what led to yesterday's events. What were the enablers and contributing factors to it? So first, let's start with what the law says. 18 U.S.C. section 2383 deals with rebellions and insurrections. It says, whoever incites, assists, or engages in any rebellion or insurrection against the authority of the United States shall be fined or imprisoned and shall be incapable of holding any office. 18 U.S.C. section 2384 deals with seditious conspiracies. And it says, if two or more persons conspire to overthrow, put down, or destroy by force the government of the United States, or by force to prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law of the United States, including the constitutional duty of our congressional leaders to affirm and certify the Electoral College votes. That is a law of the United States that was delayed yesterday. Or 18 U.S.C. section 2384 also says for seditious conspiracies, by force to seize, take, or possess any property of the United States. And of course, the United States Capitol is a federal building, and they seized it. So lots of federal crimes were committed yesterday. Not only the crimes that I've mentioned, according to 18 U.S.C. 2383 and 84, but also other more common crimes like criminal trespass, theft, interference with U.S. postal mail with the one person who happened to steal a piece of mail from Nancy Pelosi's office. Vandalism, destruction of property. Those are all various crimes that were committed yesterday, and it is my sincere hope that those who committed those crimes are held accountable for their actions. Now, they argue that this was their patriotic duty, that this was them standing up and saying Donald Trump won the election. Well, that could not be further from the truth. They argue that this is a form of protest, that they had a First Amendment right in the freedom of speech and the freedom of assembly and the freedom of expression to do what they did yesterday. And anybody who makes that argument, this is the candid truth. You do not understand constitutional law and the Supreme Court's First Amendment jurisprudence. So for example, in a case called Brandenburg v. Ohio from 1969, in that case, the United States Supreme Court said that speech that presents a clear and present danger of imminent lawlessness, of imminent criminal activity, is not protected by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. And it doesn't take mental gymnastics to figure out that what happened yesterday was lawlessness. It was a riot. It was anarchy. It was theft. It was trespass. It was breaking and entering. It was seditious. So that type of speech is not protected by the First Amendment. And to argue that it is quite frankly incorrect. It is wrong. Now, where does this lead us? Well, we have leaders, both in business and in government, calling for the 25th Amendment and the invocation thereof, and possibly for the impeachment of Donald J. Trump. But not just the impeachment, I should say, the conviction in the United States Senate to actually remove him from office, unlike what happened at the beginning of 2020, just about a year ago. So, the impeachment clause of the United States Constitution says that the president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office if convicted in an impeachment trial of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. To argue what happened yesterday was not an incitement of a riot by Donald Trump. He spoke to the crowd right before they marched over to the United States Capitol. And he said things like, "We will fight. We will take this to the Capitol and we will show the weak Republicans what we mean." I argue that this is an incitement of a riot. He encouraged protesters, and they were protesters at the time, to march on over to the Capitol and show people what they mean. This was a riot. It resulted in a riot. It resulted in anarchy. It resulted in hundreds of crimes being committed. And to argue that this is not sufficient to fit that definition of other high crimes and misdemeanors, then I don't know what is. I mean, we said that a year ago. Is it treasonous activity? Not necessarily, because I think treason involves actual action in levying war against the United States. I think we're just not there. But is this seditious activity? Absolutely. I just read what equals seditious activity to you. Now, the 25th Amendment is also being discussed at the moment. So what does the 25th Amendment say? Well, if we look at the history of the 25th Amendment, it was enacted, if I remember correctly, shortly after John F. Kennedy was shot and assassinated in 1963. And the purpose for the 25th Amendment was, let's say, for example, John F. Kennedy lived, but he was incapacitated and he couldn't fulfill the duties of the presidency. The 25th Amendment was adopted and enacted into the United States Constitution in order to allow the vice president and the other principal officers of the federal government to step in and say, okay, well, now the vice president is going to assume the duties of the presidency because the president is incapacitated. That was the original intent of the 25th Amendment, and certainly many argue that it cannot apply in today's situation because the original intent was something different. But if we look at the Supreme Court jurisprudence, there have been countless laws, including countless constitutional clauses that have been applied beyond their original intent. One of those Supreme Court justices that was passionate about recognizing that laws can evolve and be applied to cure other evils not originally intended was nonetheless Supreme Court Justice Scalia. Dating back to even the early 1800s, we had justices of the United States Supreme Court, like Justice Brandeis, who argued that while a constitutional provision was enacted to solve this evil, it should and can evolve to solve another body of evil that was not previously conceived when that protection or that provision or that clause was actually enacted by Congress or the states or the people. So the 25th Amendment can very well apply here. That is my argument. Now, what happens when the 25th Amendment is invoked? Well, first, it takes the vice president of the United States and the majority of the principal officers, which is commonly defined as the cabinet and maybe some others. But let's just move forward with the assumption that it's just the cabinet, right? The secretaries of each department of the United States executive branch. It takes a simple majority for them to say, yes, the president is unfit for office and cannot exercise the duties of the presidency of the United States. And if this occurs, if the 25th Amendment is actually invoked, the vice president then assumes the duties and responsibilities, the powers and authorities of the presidency as he or she becomes the acting president of the United States. So here's the difference between the 25th Amendment and the impeachment clause. The impeachment clause, impeaching a sitting president and convicting him actually removes him from office, full stop. Then the vice president of the United States becomes the president of the United States. And we follow the line of succession. In the 25th Amendment, the president is simply removed from power. And then the vice president becomes the acting president. Now, some argue, well, we have 2 weeks left of President Trump's term, so why bother? Why do these things? And it's fair to recognize that he has the powers and authorities of the presidency and the Oval Office at his disposal every day up until Joe Biden is actually inaugurated. And what can he do? Well, just look at the events of yesterday. That shows you the power and the reach and the influence that he has. Now, some also argue, well, why did it take so long? Where were the security? Where was it? Some media outlets have reported that the National Guard was not called in, that resources from the Department of Defense were not called in. Well, who leads the Department of Defense? At the end of the day, it's the Commander-in-Chief. At the end of the day, it's the President of the United States. And so some reports, and I have not verified these for myself, have reported that Donald Trump may have influenced the inaction or ordered the inaction of our federal government. And then you saw governors of neighboring states to Washington, D.C., like Maryland and Virginia, send in, reinforcements to help with the chaos that yesterday presented. With that said, I think it's fair that we have a conversation in this country to evaluate what enabled and what contributed to yesterday's events. How did we get here? One contributing factor, again, I've been arguing it for months and I will continue to argue it, is the technological design of social media and digital media platforms that perpetuated the disinformation and the falsehoods and the falsities that led to the sincere belief of millions of people in this country and the however many people who showed up yesterday in Washington, D.C., and however many people who broke into the United States Capitol and seized it. Let's review the history of technological platforms for a second. Back in, the early 2000s and even the late 2000s, these social media platforms did not have algorithms. They were designed to show the content in reverse chronological order. If you remember the good old days of Facebook and the good old days of Twitter, the most recently posted content would appear at the top, and then it would go in reverse chronological order. And around 2016, 2017, 2018, these platforms developed algorithms that curated content, that would show you content based off of relevance and what was relevant to you, what was engaging to you. Because their business models quite simply revolve around user engagement. The more time you spend on a platform, the more content you engage with, the more advertising you would see, and the more money that they would make. This is a fundamental problem that needs to be addressed and needs to be solved. Algorithms curated content. And so if you engaged in content that was pure disinformation, that alleged widespread election fraud, then you are more likely to see more content just like that. Why? Because it was engaging to you. And what algorithms create behind our news feeds on Twitter, on Facebook and the like, is an echo chamber that lives and thrives on confirmation bias. What do I mean by that? Well, again, let's take this as an example. If you engaged in some level of content that was disinformation, that was straight up false, or even slightly false and slightly misleading, you are more likely to see additional content that said the same thing or said something very similar. And as you did that, more curation would happen. The more your newsfeed will show you content that fit that narrative. And confirmation bias is simply, when you see information that fits the narrative that you already believe, it just reaffirms what you already believe, even if your beliefs are frankly false or rooted in falsity, rooted in falsehoods, rooted in misinformation. So where should we go from here? Well, we need to evaluate. We need to look ourselves in the mirror and say, what do we need to change as a society? From a technological standpoint, I argue, certainly changes need to be made, but also from our leadership standpoint. If we allow the disinformation to circulate, if we remain silent, if we were complicit in the perpetuation of these false narratives that led to sincere beliefs of these rioters and anarchists and insurrectionists yesterday, then we need to evaluate what is it that we can do as a society and what is it that I can do as an individual. Those who argue that you have a First Amendment right to speak false information, well, that is true. But we also have a collective, patriotic, and civic duty to make sure that in our form of government, in a democracy, in a republic where we elect our representatives, where we as the people elect our officials, in order for that to function properly, in order for us to truly be a democracy or republic or a democratic republic or Republican democracy, whatever you want to call, we must be rooted in truth and facts. This is not something that we say, oh, I have a different perception of what is true and what is factual. This is what we must admit, what actually occurs, what actually happens. And we can have differing opinions on the perception of facts, but we must accept the facts as is, right? We must accept the facts as is. They are fact. We must accept science as is. We must accept our democratic institutions for what they're meant to do. Questioning authority is good. That's what we should do in a democratic republic. That's what we should do. We should question our officials because we need to make choices as far as who we want to govern us. That is the fundamental concept of our government. So with that said, I conclude today by saying, hopefully we move forward as a country that unifies, that reflects, and that builds better as we move forward. Hopefully we move forward towards a more perfect union by learning from what occurred, what led up to this, what enabled and contributed to yesterday's events. That is what I hope. May God bless the United States.